When you left, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no explosion, no final argument that announced the end. It was quiet, almost unnoticeable. And that's why it took time for the weight of your absence to be felt. At first, life continued the same way it always had. The days still moved forward. Conversations still happened. But something subtle was missing. The emotional safety she once lived inside was gone, and she didn't realize it because real value is rarely loud while it's present. People don't recognize consistency when they're surrounded by it. They mistake it for permanence. They assume it will always be there, unchanged, unchallenged. You became part of the background of her life, not because you lacked importance, but because you provided stability. And stability doesn't demand attention. It doesn't scream for appreciation. It simply shows up, and when something always shows up, the mind stops measuring its worth. It stops protecting it. That's how value gets overlooked. Your absence changed the rhythm of her world. The things you handled without being asked suddenly became problems she had to face alone. The calm you brought without effort was replaced by uncertainty. Small inconveniences grew heavier. Emotional moments felt sharper, and slowly the realization began to form, not all at once, but piece by piece, that what she lost wasn't just a person, it was balance. At first she tried to fill the space. Distractions came easily. New conversations, new attention, new energy. But distractions don't replace foundations, they only delay awareness. Because when the noise settles, absence becomes undeniable. That's when memory stops editing the past and starts telling the truth. She began to remember the way you listened without interrupting. The way you stayed present when things became uncomfortable. The way you carried weight quietly, never announcing your effort. Those moments didn't seem special then because they were consistent. Now they felt rare. Absence sharpens perspective. It removes entitlement and replaces it with comparison. And comparison is where clarity lives. She started noticing what others didn't do. How they disappeared under pressure. How their words lacked follow-through. How their attention was conditional. And in those moments, your absence wasn't empty, it was instructive. It showed her what real effort looks like by revealing what happens when it's gone. The hardest truth wasn't missing you. It was understanding why she missed you. Because missing someone isn't about loneliness, it's about recognizing the role they played. She didn't miss constant messages. She missed reliability. She didn't miss affection. She missed reassurance. She didn't miss presence. She missed the way life felt easier when you were steady. And that realization doesn't come quickly. It comes after disappointment teaches patience, and loss teaches appreciation. Your absence didn't make her weak. It made her aware. It stripped away assumptions and exposed reality. She saw that what she once considered ordinary was actually uncommon. That what she once felt entitled to was actually earned. And that realization carries weight, because it can't be undone. Once value is seen clearly, it changes how the past is understood. You didn't leave to be remembered. You left because you respected yourself enough to stop being invisible. And in doing so, you allowed absence to do what presence never could, reveal your true worth. Sometimes the only way someone understands who you were is by feeling what life is like without you. You tried to explain yourself once, maybe twice. You tried to show her through patience, through consistency, through being there when it mattered most. But some lessons can't be taught by words or even by love. They can only be taught by life. And when you stepped back, life stepped forward and became the teacher she never listened to while you were standing in front of her. While you were present, your efforts softened the impact of reality. You absorbed stress before it reached her. You solved problems before they became emergencies. You stayed calm so she didn't have to be. And because of that, she never fully understood the weight you carried. Not because she was cruel, but because comfort hides complexity. When someone shields you from storms, you forget storms exist. It's only when the protection is gone that the rain starts to teach. Life doesn't explain gently. It doesn't choose its words carefully. It teaches through contrast, through absence, through experience. And suddenly, the things she once dismissed as normal became painfully noticeable by their absence. Decisions felt heavier. Emotions felt unmanaged. Situations that you handled with quiet confidence now demanded energy she wasn't prepared to give. And slowly, the realization formed that what you offered wasn't luck, it was effort. She began facing the same situations you once navigated for her, but without your guidance, without your steadiness. And that's when understanding arrived, not emotionally, but practically. She saw how much patience it takes to stay when it's easier to leave. How much discipline it takes to be consistent when no one is watching. How much strength it takes to remain grounded when things get uncomfortable. These weren't romantic gestures. They were life skills. And you had been demonstrating them all along. The world has a way of removing illusions. People promise, then disappear. Attention comes, then fades. Support feels conditional. And in those moments, life draws a quiet comparison. Not out loud, but internally. She began to notice that others reacted where you responded. They avoided where you endured. They spoke where you acted. And slowly, without anyone saying your name, life kept pointing back to you. You didn't need to defend your character. Life validated it. You didn't need to highlight your value. Reality revealed it. Every letdown sharpened her memory. Every broken expectation reframed the past. She started understanding that you weren't overprotective, you were prepared. You weren't controlling, you were committed. You weren't boring, you were stable. And stability only becomes attractive when chaos becomes exhausting. What she learned too late was that love isn't just emotion, it's structure, it's reliability, it's showing up on ordinary days, not just emotional ones. And life made sure she felt the difference. Because once you're exposed to inconsistency, you start craving certainty. Once you experience unpredictability, you start missing someone who was solid. And that's when the mind connects dots the heart once ignored. You tried to teach her through presence, but life taught her through absence. You offered understanding, but life offered experience. And experience is the only teacher that never gets argued with. When she looks back now, she doesn't just remember how you made her feel. She understands what you did for her life. Sometimes the lesson only lands when the teacher steps aside and lets life take over. After you were gone, she didn't stop living. She didn't sit still waiting for the past to return. She moved forward, met new people, stepped into new conversations, explored new energy. From the outside, it looked like replacement, like progress, like she had already moved on. But moving on and moving forward are not the same thing. One is motion, the other is direction, and direction is where truth waits. At first, the new felt exciting. Fresh attention has a way of creating illusion. New words feel deeper because they haven't been tested. New promises feel stronger because they haven't been broken yet. New people often shine because they haven't been placed under pressure. And for a moment, she thought she had found something equal, maybe even better. But life doesn't reveal depth in beginnings. It reveals it in endurance. Time has a way of stripping people down to who they really are. And as days passed, cracks began to show. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. Missed follow-through, emotional inconsistency, presence that faded when things became inconvenient. She started noticing that what others offered came with conditions, that their attention depended on mood, that their effort expired when comfort ended. And that's when comparison began, not consciously but instinctively. She didn't compare faces, she compared feelings. She compared how safe she felt speaking freely, how supported she felt during stress, how calm her nervous system felt when life became heavy. And slowly, she realized that what she thought she replaced was never replaced at all. Because you weren't just someone who showed up when it was easy. You were someone who stayed when it wasn't. Others could entertain her. You grounded her. Others could distract her. You stabilized her. Others could offer excitement. You offered security. And those differences don't stand out in happy moments. They stand out in difficult ones. When things went wrong, when emotions ran high, when life demanded maturity instead of charm, that's when the absence of what you gave became impossible to ignore. She met people who talked a lot but did little. People who wanted connection without responsibility. People who wanted the benefits of closeness without the weight of commitment. And with each experience, the truth became clearer. Consistency is rare. Emotional availability is rare. Someone who chooses you daily, not just when it's convenient, is rare. And rarity is never appreciated until it's gone. You didn't lose value because she met others. Your value increased through contrast. Every comparison sharpened the memory of how you listened, how you stayed, how you didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. She began to understand that what you offered wasn't common, it was uncommon. And uncommon things don't get replaced. They get recognized too late. The most difficult realization wasn't that others fell short. It was understanding why. Because they weren't meant to be you. They were never built with your patience, your discipline, your emotional depth. And that realization carries a quiet regret. Not loud enough to announce itself, but strong enough to pull her thoughts backward when life feels unstable. She didn't come back because others were bad. She came back because they revealed the truth. They showed her the difference between attention and intention, between presence and permanence, between interest and investment. And through that clarity, she finally understood what she once held without protecting. You were never replaced. You were revealed, slowly, painfully, and unmistakably, through everyone who tried and failed to be you. Time didn't just pass after you left, it worked on her. Quietly, patiently, without emotion. Because time doesn't take sides, it reveals perspective. The same things she once overlooked didn't disappear, they waited to be understood. Growth has a way of changing how the past is seen, not by rewriting it, but by finally reading it clearly. When she was younger in her thinking, she measured love by intensity, by how strong something felt in the moment, by excitement, attention, and emotional highs. And because of that, what you offered felt simple, almost ordinary, not because it lacked depth, but because it lacked drama. Stability doesn't impress an unprepared mind. It feels boring to someone who hasn't yet been exhausted by chaos. As life applied pressure, her priorities shifted. Situations became heavier. Responsibilities became real. Emotions became less playful and more demanding. And with that weight came a new lens. She started valuing peace over passion, consistency over charm, effort over words. The very traits she once questioned became the ones she began searching for everywhere else. Growth doesn't arrive as a single moment. It arrives through patterns, through repeated disappointment, through realizing that not everyone who speaks confidently can stand firmly, through learning that emotional maturity isn't loud, it's reliable. And slowly, her perception recalibrated. What once felt too much from you now felt necessary. What once felt ordinary now felt rare. She started recognizing the difference between someone who reacts and someone who responds, between someone who promises and someone who delivers, between someone who stays present when things are easy and someone who stays when they're not. And in that recognition, your past behavior took on new meaning. You weren't rigid, you were disciplined. You weren't distant, you were composed. You weren't unromantic, you were stable. The irony of growth is that it often arrives after loss. You don't realize the value of the foundation until you're forced to build without one. She learned that emotional safety isn't automatic, that loyalty isn't guaranteed, that patience isn't common. And once those lessons settle in, the mind begins revisiting the past with a different level of respect. She began seeing how much you gave without demanding applause, how often you chose understanding over ego, how you showed restraint when reaction would have been easier. Those weren't flaws, they were signs of maturity she couldn't recognize at the time. Because appreciation requires alignment. And alignment only comes when someone grows into the level of what they once received. Growth also brought accountability. She stopped viewing the past through justification and started seeing it through responsibility. Not with self-blame, but with honesty. She understood that she didn't lose you because of bad luck. She lost you because she didn't have the awareness to protect something valuable. And that awareness changes everything. Now, what she once saw as basic feels extraordinary. Because extraordinary isn't about intensity, it's about sustainability. It's about someone who doesn't waver when emotions fluctuate, someone who remains consistent when circumstances shift, someone who chooses growth over drama. And that understanding doesn't fade. Once perception matures, it doesn't return to its old state. You didn't change to become valuable. Time changed her ability to see it. Regret doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself the moment someone walks away. Real regret is quiet, slow, and heavy. It builds over time, formed not from loneliness, but from understanding. And that understanding only comes after life has stripped away illusions and left nothing but truth. At first, she didn't regret losing you. She justified it. She told herself it was necessary, that things had to end, that something better would come. And for a while, that story worked. Because denial is protective. It keeps reality at a distance until the mind is ready to face it. But stories eventually collapse under experience. And experience has a way of revealing what words cannot defend. Regret was born the moment she realized what she lost wasn't replaceable. Not because you were perfect, but because you were present. You were consistent in a world that fluctuates. You were steady in moments where others faltered, and that realization didn't hurt immediately, it settled. It showed up in quiet comparisons, in moments of disappointment, in the growing awareness that what she once had was foundational, not temporary. She didn't regret an argument. She regretted misjudging character. She didn't regret a moment. She regretted a pattern. The pattern of overlooking effort, of mistaking patience for weakness, of assuming stability would always be available. Regret came when she understood that what you gave required strength, and strength isn't common. There's a difference between missing someone and regretting losing them. Missing is emotional. Regret is cognitive. Missing fades when distraction appears. Regret deepens with clarity. And clarity came when she saw how rare it is to find someone who doesn't disappear when things become uncomfortable. Someone who chooses resolution over escape. Someone who carries weight without making it visible. Life forced perspective. It showed her how many people talk about loyalty but leave at the first inconvenience. How many promise growth but resist responsibility. How many want connection without commitment. And in those realizations, regret found its shape. Not dramatic, not emotional, but undeniable. She realized she didn't lose love. She lost security, she lost grounding. She lost someone who would have stood firm while the world shifted. And that understanding doesn't create desperation. It creates humility. Because regret at that level isn't about wanting someone back. It's about acknowledging the cost of not valuing them when you had the chance. What made the regret heavier was knowing you didn't leave impulsively. You tried. You stayed longer than most would. You communicated until silence became your last option. And when she recognized that, regret turned inward. Not as shame, but as acceptance. Acceptance that timing matters, awareness matters. And when those are missing, even good things are lost. She didn't come back because she was lonely. She came back because she was aware. Because regret taught her what comfort hid. Because life showed her that losing someone solid creates a gap that nothing superficial can fill. Regret wasn't punishment, it was realization. You didn't go silent as a strategy. You didn't disappear to make a point. You went quiet because you reached a place where explaining yourself felt heavier than letting go. And that moment, when you chose peace over persuasion, shifted everything. Because silence backed by self-respect is never empty. It carries weight. It forces reality to speak where words once failed. When you stopped talking, the dynamic changed. There was no argument to revisit, no message to overanalyze, no tone to misunderstand. Just absence. And absence removes distractions. It strips situations down to truth. Without your voice present, she couldn't project meaning onto your words anymore. She could only feel the space you left behind. And that space became uncomfortable because it revealed how much of her emotional stability had rested on you. Your silence wasn't cold. It was controlled. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. You stopped offering explanations to someone who wasn't ready to understand them. And in doing so, you forced the only teacher left to step in life. Life doesn't soften lessons. It doesn't negotiate, it shows repeatedly what words could not convince. In your absence, she expected distance to fade you. Instead, it amplified you. Every situation that required steadiness reminded her of how you handled things without drama. Every emotional moment that felt unmanaged reminded her of how grounded you were. Your silence became a mirror, reflecting everything she once overlooked. Because when someone who used to be present becomes unreachable, not emotionally, but energetically, it creates a shift that can't be ignored. You didn't announce boundaries. You lived them. You didn't explain your worth. You embodied it by walking away from being misunderstood. And that's what made your silence powerful. It wasn't reactive. It wasn't bitter. It was final enough to be felt, but respectful enough to force reflection instead of resentment. She began to realize that you weren't silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you had already said everything through consistency, through patience, through effort. And when those things were no longer available, the loss became clear. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because silence doesn't rush understanding. It waits for readiness. Your quiet forced her to confront her own noise, the justifications, the assumptions, the belief that you'd always return to clarify, to reassure, to stabilize. And when you didn't, the illusion broke. She realized that your presence had been a choice, not a guarantee. And choices once withdrawn reveal their value. You didn't close the door loudly. You simply stopped holding it open. And that subtle shift changed the entire meaning of the past. She understood that you didn't leave out of ego, but out of self-respect. That you didn't disappear because you stopped caring, but because you cared enough not to keep shrinking. And that realization carries weight, because it reframes everything. Now, if she's coming back, it's not because you called her. It's because your silence taught her something no argument ever could. It showed her what strength looks like when it no longer needs validation, what maturity looks like when it chooses distance over disorder, what value looks like when it stops asking to be seen. Your silence wasn't absence, it was a statement. And sometimes, the most powerful statement a person can make is walking away without saying another word.